Welcome everybody this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today. Ms. Maya Sobchuk, who is at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo, and is also a research fellow in the AI governance program at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. Maya has done a lot of research on disinformation and misinformation, and has spoken at a large number of events on this topic, and has a wealth of expertise, which she will share some of that expertise with you in today's lecture. And also we'll be discussing a topic that is increasingly coming into focus of attention, and that's the topic of LLM grooming. So misinformation and disinformation and the LLM space. So with that, I'll hand over the floor to Maya. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. As said, my name is Maya. I work at Sobchuk. My research is specifically about control operations, mostly from Russia. So I just want to tell you that I'm giving this talk about the information space from the perspective of social networks, specifically of my country, and how it influences disinformation. I focus on Russia specifically because I think they're sort of the world leaders in propaganda and disinformation, and I'll kind of explain why later in my talk. But because they are such a good case study for understanding how influence operations work and how disinformation spreads, I think that's a good base to start off from. So I just want to give the brief notes about kind of where I come from in terms of my research background. So we have a lot to get through. First of all, Mark asked me to give an overview of how things are looking right now in terms of the media, in terms of our information space, and how disinformation is operating at the moment. And there's a lot, and none of this is good news, unfortunately. So we have a lot to cover. I will try to sort of give an introduction to how influence operations work. And again, I'm going to give it from the perspective of someone that works on Russia, because I think that there are philosophies behind their influence operation, and also inspired most of the other countries that are now operating their disinformation tactics. So I think they're just a really good. And I will sprinkle in some actual influence operations that are grounded in actual data and facts, and not just maybe an opinion about Russian foreign policy, whether you agree or disagree with it. Influence operations present themselves in a very fact-based way, and so you can connect this to how you see foreign policy in general, but there's actual data scientists that work on so much of this. Of course, we talk about AI and how emerging technologies are included in all of this, and they've made a problem of here. Talk about the US because how the US has behaved in the last year has unfortunately made the problem much worse. Even when it comes to countries like Russia and China, it's actually supported their influence operations and their impacts. And we'll talk about Japan as well and how this is affecting here. And here, I'm curious to hear also your perspective on how you see this issue going on here, if you think Japan is affected at all. And also, I want to hear your ideas for how Japan can counter this. So just keep that in mind as you listen, because I'm also curious to hear your perspective as people that live. So, like I said, I will start with explaining how Russia sees influence operations. Again, because I think they are sort of the historical leaders of this issue, and they've perfected it. They are very, very sophisticated and very good at what they do. And this stems from the Soviet era, right? So psychological warfare was really a central element of how Russia conducted, or the Soviet Union at the time, conducted its foreign policy. These ideas of reflexive control, maskirovka, and active measures, which is sort of making the targets of making the targets sort of already believe what Russia wants without them realizing it, and getting them to engage in some of the behaviors that Russian foreign policy wants without them realizing. So this is an important point because Russian influence operations are so effective because they're not obvious. They're not trying to convince anyone that, you should support Russia. Russia is the best country in the world. This is what we want you to believe. No, it's very hidden, and it's connected to things that their audience already believes in. And this has continued also in modern Russia. Like the Gerasimov doctrine is kind of the most obvious example of this, where he's a kind of head general in 2010s in Russia, and he said that non-military tactics are in fact the actual war. I think we tend to think of war, military, as like actual physical war, right? So like missiles and guns and all those things. But in reality, to a country like Russia, it's actually everything that comes before that. So in Ukraine, it's a very actually obvious example because in reality, Russia had this going information war. I mean, during the times of the Soviet Union, but also leading up to the full-scale invasion and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And because they sort of failed in their goals there, they went into the physical domain. And so this is also an important point and why I think that we should study this topic, because if you're interested in military and like preventing war, I think you need to start with the information space. Because in Ukraine, for example, it was so obvious that this was going to happen. So how does Russia actually achieve it? Of course, it's the state media first, right? So Russia Today is Sputnik, which is the international arm of Russian media, if you can call it that. It has a completely different media sources for its massive audience. It tailors its international outlook in a very specific way in the different languages that Russia Today and Sputnik use. So that's also an important point. The more covert means are troll farms. So the most infamous one is the Internet Research Agency, which is the image here. So this is what troll farms used to look like. The Internet Research Agency doesn't exist anymore, but it was a big part of the 2016 elections in the US. And a lot of the people that were sitting there 9 to 5, or actually all night too, typing up comments for America on Facebook, it was linked to actually influencing the results of the election in 2016 and later on. And troll farms like this were so important to the Russian strategy because it's sort of impossible to trace back to the Russian state. Because, for example, the Internet Research Agency was formed by Wagner, by the head of Wagner, Prigozhin, who died in a mysterious helicopter accident. But it's really difficult to link it back to the Russian state. And so Russia sort of operates on this plausible deniability. They also pay influencers, which we'll talk about in a case study later, but voices that people already trust. People don't know that they're connected with Russia, and instead they're kind of giving out little nuggets of Russian talking points and manipulating people that way. What Russia does really well, and I want to drive home again, is that they really do their research. They really understand the audience. So they're able to divide societies from within that way, because they don't just target, for example, the right wing in the US. They also target the left, and they sort of target both sides and they try to tear the societies apart. There's also the illusion of plurality, which is when all of these different factors work together, kind of all these different, the traditional news, the social media, maybe your podcast you listen to, all of these things are kind of repeating the same thing. It kind of looks like you're getting different points of view, when in reality it's actually just coming from the Russian state, and you don't realize it. So this, of course, Ukraine is the obvious case study in terms of what Russia wants to achieve. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we don't have that much time, but I just want to point here, focus towards this image, which is just a screenshot of my personal Instagram, which basically everyone I knew, I think, reposted this when, February 24th of 2022, when the war first broke out, because they kind of thought that it was in support of Ukraine, in support of other wars around the world, when in reality, Redfish Stream actually got taken down because, and you can see it here, even Meta marked it, that it's Russian state-controlled media. But people didn't really realize that it was Russian propaganda. They thought it was actually an account that has a lot of post-colonial messaging, anti-colonial messaging. But in reality, it was motivating anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian sentiment kind of secretly. And so this is an example of even in my personal life, where a lot of people that thought they were supporting Ukraine actually were reposting this. And it looks at first like it is sort of in support of Ukraine, right? Oh no, Russian invasion, but it's also sort of says condemn war everywhere. So on the day of the full-scale invasion, they're showing all these things that are happening in the rest of the world. Look there too, look away from Ukraine, and also Crimea is not in the map of Ukraine. And actually this post was posted several hours before Russian troops crossed into Ukraine. And so obviously connected to the Russian war. And this will be important for some of the later case studies. Operation Doppelganger is one I really want to talk about because it's one of the most infamous influence operations that sort of the disinfo research community likes to talk about. Few Russian companies, the Social Design Agency, which is now the new edition sort of the IRA, the troll farm I talked about before, was able to just essentially spread a bunch of Russian propaganda and also paid some very high profile American influencers. And it was such a successful wide-scale operation that it even reached the US Justice Department, which uncovered the fact that they were paying American influencers, like the Russian journalists were paying them. And so it reached even like the highest levels of the American government. And it was kind of known to actually influence the election, the most recent election in the US, and also other European elections. So what does Doppelganger actually look like? The first is content production. So they created clones of legitimate media websites and government websites. So for example, you would see the website, it looks exactly like CNN. It says CNN, it has all of the, design of it and of other legitimate media sources. But in reality, the content is actually Russian. So that's where the name Doppelganger comes from, because it copied all these websites. It also created anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian websites. And then they wanted to distribute and amplify all of these new websites. So that was then done through comments on social media, through fake personas. So people were these like bots on social media that looked like legitimate accounts. Where it gets interesting is they also bought ads and spread them to spread this messaging on platforms like Facebook. And this is where it gets interesting because then it involves, these tech companies who are making money essentially off of, Russian propaganda. And so this is where, you had to make the tech companies accountable, and they were able to take down some of the posts, but it's actually very difficult to track. And now Meta has actually dismantled its trust and safety team, which is a huge part of, but we'll get into that later. And these are the three influencers, some of the most famous influencers in the US, like pretty right-wing, and they were paid up to $10 million by Russia Today journalists. Two of them were indicted by the Justice Department, but they would sort of sprinkle in Russian propaganda into their content because it was like they were literally told what to say. And this is particularly effective because their viewers aren't necessarily thinking that this is the Russian state telling them what to think. These are people they already trust, who built their platforms for years, who they listened to for years, that maybe don't always talk about just Russia, Ukraine, or whatever. And so they have a credibility, and that people don't realize that actually it's the Russian state influencing them. And this is where the application to our region also comes in, because now Russia and China are sort of amplifying each other. They're coordinating on the same narratives. So before, these two countries were not friends. But recently, given the world affairs, they've sort of aligned on some of their foreign policy goals. And in 2021, they signed a secret media agreement that was it was secret because it had to be hacked by Western journalists to find out that they wanted to keep this secret. But their journalists are collaborating on some of the narratives that they're saying. So, for instance, Russian narratives are ending up with Chinese media. For example, the conspiracy theory that American bioweapons are in Ukraine. This is a conspiracy theory that has existed for a really long time. For the past 20 years, I think Russia has been saying that we have bioweapons in Ukraine. But it sort of died off. And then when the full-scale invasion happened, it reemerged in Chinese media and in the Global Times. So it's this very interesting sort of like connection where this conspiracy theory that for sure the Chinese audiences did not care about and did not really was in the top of their mind is now being reiterated by Chinese media. And so it's interesting how what Russia wants is ending up now in Chinese media. And the same is reversed for the Russian media. And so For example, this is a screenshot from Telegram, a channel of like a really famous Telegram influencer in Russia. It's about Taiwan and how the US sort of chose the election results in Taiwan. And it's saying that, oh yeah, Uncle Sam is the one that's like the puppet master, right? And so I'm sure Russian audiences really don't care about Taiwanese elections, and yet now this is being pushed to them on Telegram. So it's really interesting that, well, also Chinese foreign policy goals are ending up in domestic Russian Telegram channels to discredit democracy as a whole, to discredit Taiwan as a democratic state, and of course the US. And so China actually used to be very bad at influence operations. They're very much focused on the domestic information control and on the diaspora, Chinese-speaking diaspora. But that is all now changing very rapidly. And my research at the moment concerns this. And my argument is that they're really studying what Russia has done for the last 100 years of being very good at influence operations, especially the last 10 years of social media influence operations. They're taking the best lessons learned and they're applying it to their own, because they now want to influence foreign audiences and not just Chinese-speaking audiences. So after the Russian success in influencing the 2016 election in the US, China saw that and said, hey, we want to do that too. Why are our influence operations getting zero engagement? It's because they used to be just slop on the internet, very badly translated from Mandarin, very fake-looking accounts and personas, and so they were getting zero engagement. And now, after sort of incorporating some of these Russian tactics, they started doing the sort of plurality thing I mentioned before, where they used these networks across different social media platforms. They took a more subtle and sophisticated approach, so they made sure, again, to study their actual audience, like Russia does so well, and actually know what the people that they want to influence care about. And they actually posed, in the example that I will show you now in this case study, as actual Americans, and made accounts that were actually believable to be actual Americans. So Samouflage is another influence operation that has existed for a long time, actually, but it's only recently been starting to get engagement because I think some of these Russian tactics are now being used in it. It's kind of the Chinese effort to influence the 2024 elections in the US, where they posed as Americans supporting Trump to sort of motivate voting for him, I guess. And this actually received some very important. One example of this post receiving a lot of engagement is when Alex Jones, a really famous American influencer with millions and millions of views, reposted a post from a Samouflage network. And this is kind of like a 2-for-1, right? Because it has the Samouflage post, Chinese influence operation, has a link to a Russia Today article, a real Russia Today article. And it was reposted by, got millions of views because someone with a lot of credibility in the US reposted it. And so we can see that this case study is getting a lot of traction, and it's good. The part we've all been waiting for, AI and how it's affecting all of this. So before we used to need, that scary looking building, the Internet Research Agency. Now all those people have been fired, no longer exist. We no longer need them because AI is doing their job for them and they're a million times faster. So it's able to generate some of these comments constantly, create fake personas. It's also able to analyze the success of that and then tailor the strategy based on that to make them even more effective. So it's kind of doing 2 in 1. And so this really helps like the Kremlin with its goals and the sort of reflexive control idea that I talked about before. So that's one example of AI, like viewing these comments, being able to analyze the influence operations. But there's another side of that, which isn't just the outward-looking comments we see. It's also behind the scenes and how AI actually works, which I think is the part where it gets really scary. And the technical term for it is called LLM learning. So the large language models which are behind ChatGPT, they're trained on these massive data sets, right? So the entire internet. And so LLM grooming refers to when certain actors are trying to shape these models so that their output is the viewpoint of the Russian state. So when you're able to train your data set, and most of the content is actually Russia Today or similar Russian viewpoints, it's going to turn out and look very credible when you type into ChatGPT, who does Crimea belong to or whatever, then it's going to put out, Russian sources. And people really believe that because ChatGPT seems credible. And you don't think that Russia is behind the answers of ChatGPT. So the really famous study of this is the Pravda network, which is a Russian influence operation to do this exact thing, influence the results that ChatGPT gives you. So how do they do it? They had hundreds of websites that replicated Russian propaganda content. So Russia Today basically just duplicated on thousands of sites. And what's interesting about this is that it's not optimized for humans to read it. It's optimized for the LLM to read it and for it to be sucked into this massive data set. And so the goal is to flood the information space so that this network overwhelms actual factual information. The findings by Institute for Strategic Dialogue just came out a few days ago. I really encourage you to read it. It's in this QR code because what they have here, other than just the analysis behind, they tracked this network for 1 year to see if it's actually effective. Is it actually turning out the result we want? Unfortunately, the answer is not what we want to hear because the answer is yes. Of course, it has a massive impact. And actual news sites are quoting the cloud network as real news. So it's really difficult to distinguish now because of how sophisticated this network is, what's an actual news site and what's not. And this website that I'm linking to here also they made a Chrome extension so that every time you go and cloud the network affiliated website, it'll tell you, which I think is really cool. So I think it's in some of the first lines of this article. It's really short. It's to the point, so I really encourage you to read it. And I check out this Google Chrome extension because I think it's really, really genius. So what is the point of all this? I mean, I got into studying this very niche topic, not because I'm a nerd for, how many of these fake comments am I seeing on Facebook? I think that what this says about the world we live in and our reality and what we believe in is very dystopian and has a lot of existentialist sort of, ideas behind it. It's really scary when you realize that so much of what we see on the internet, what you think are maybe legitimate accounts that you follow that have things that you agree with are actually influenced also by nuggets of Russian propaganda and don't really realize it. You think they're genuine thoughts, and you're able to critically think and analyze and think, oh no, yes, this is something I believe in, but in reality, it was fed to you by an authoritarian government. I think that's a really scary world to live in, and I think that what happened in Ukraine is the most obvious example of that, because Russia just had this information war going on in Ukraine for so long. And they didn't really achieve what they wanted to. I mean, in reality, they did. I think they had a lot of influence in Ukraine and really could have held on to it, but they got too greedy, and so they invaded physically. What I'm saying is, it doesn't really take Ukraine for all of us to be at war with Russia. They're doing the same. They're starting to do the same thing in Japan, which I will get to later, but they're doing it around the world. And they've really influenced how people think and perceive Ukraine and other issues around the world, because you don't realize that some of this content is actually from the Russian state and now, China. Of course, most countries do some form of this, but this is such an obvious example. And so we need to really think about what kind of internet we want to engage in. And I think the best term to summarize that is cognitive warfare, right? Because it's not just disinformation, it's genuinely a war on our thoughts. And what that entails is literally foreign policy goals of so many countries. And we're training. So That leads me into talking about the US, which is really having an impact on all of this. It's really increasing the effectiveness of all of the case studies that I talked about before, especially because of the US aid cuts and the foreign assistance cuts. Because what that did is it wiped out basically most of the world's independent media and civil society, which is actually funded by the US. You know, regardless of what they think of the US, American foreign policy, and what its impact on the world, one thing that the US did really well was fund so much of the world's independent journalism, which did actually provide real facts that balanced out what authoritarian countries wanted us to know. And now it's all been shut down, essentially. I mean, so much of even Ukraine's media was cut, like 90%, I think, or something was actually funded by American aid. Same is true in our region as well. Radio Free Asia, one of like the most important independent media of this region, had to shut its doors a few weeks ago. It finally went out of money. And that's very scary because what we're left with then is just the case studies I mentioned, and people with money that can afford to talk about this news. It's also a lot of symbolism, right? Because it shows that like Western democracies this is not a value that we care about anymore. Not a world I want to live within, because then the authoritarian one is the one that is correct. Right? Ideals of speech and media are no longer something we care about. And lastly, also the tech giants are also a big part of this. It's not just governments and it's not just civil society. It's also the private sector, because all of this is going on their platforms and they're dismantling the trust and safety teams now. Even if they started to before the Trump administration, but now they're emboldened to even more because tracking all of this is so much hard work, and taking it down is so difficult. It takes a lot of money and time and a big teams that make them zero profit. And so they've started to completely wipe it out. Meta has completely dismantled their trust and safety team. And so the only people left doing this are people like me, who's like one person in Japan, and then other people like in these think tanks, that are essentially doing it because they care. And that's just not enough. We have to hold these platforms accountable. No one's going to do that if the governments don't care anymore. Okay, what about Japan? I think the idea that Japan is not prone to disinformation is completely false. When I first came here 2 years ago and I started interviewing experts on this issue, some journalists actually told me that we don't have disinformation here. Japan is an island, which is a crazy thought considering how the internet works. But this is sort of the idea that Japan had about this issue. And then the Fukushima water release happened, which motivated a lot of Chinese disinformation around the topic. Essentially, when Japan was releasing the cleansed radioactive wastewater from the earthquake that happened, China started saying that Japan, the water was not clean, Japan was ruining the environment, and is no longer a good ally. And they actually stopped buying Japanese seafood. Russia joined in. So obviously this was extremely detrimental to Japan, and such a obvious economic and physical impact and reputational impact that is just beyond little comments on Facebook. This is a much greater issue than that, and this is such an obvious example. So this post is from Taiwan. It supposedly says that, see guys, look, this is what Japan is releasing into the ocean. Like, they're not a good ally. This photo is actually from Mexico, from an oil spill that happened many, many years back. So this shows sort of the priority in trying to discredit Japan on the world stage as an ally, and just tell everyone Japan is ruining the environment. Even though the experts on this team that verified that the water was safe to release had both Russian and Chinese scientists. Japan is a priority country for Russia also when it comes to disinformation. Not as much as Europe and the US, of course, but it's still there and it's only increasing. In the last 2 years, Russia has really ramped up its activities here. Russia Today and Sputnik have, in the last 2 years, really started acting up their activities all of a sudden. And the Pravda network that I talked about recently has Japanese domain name. So it's wanting to influence the Japanese language results on ChatGPT. And the only other Asian website in the cloud network is Taiwan. So it shows what is a priority to Russia when it's doing these influence operations. So what can Japan do about this? Like I said, I think there's still in the expert community here, very frustrating for me. Still, people think that disinformation is not really an issue here, that Japanese language is so different, that Japan is not influenced by this, and that because there's high trust in media in Japan, which isn't as common in other countries, that because of that, Japan is immune. It's just not true. Fukushima water release incident really changed the Japanese mentality, the Japanese government's mentality on this issue. They started writing in this information into some of the foreign policy priorities, which is a very big step for Japan. However, kind of didn't go beyond that. They said that they would create a dedicated center to track this. They kind of didn't. At the moment, different ministries within the Japanese government have intelligence agencies that track disinfo, and they send up reports, and then nothing comes down. Nothing really happens. And so I think like a dedicated center, maybe within a cybersecurity ministry that would actually take this seriously, would be a good policy solution. I also hope the new government takes Russia also as seriously as China. I think, again, people kind of think Russia is far away. Russia, you can see Russia in parts of Japan, and it's really not. There's still a border dispute between Japan and Russia. And so, of course, China is the priority in the region, which makes sense. But I also hope that given some of this evidence that people just aren't aware of here, that's the new government also takes on Russia as a threat. And I think some of the things the Japanese government is trying to do at the moment is collaborate more with European countries in terms of sharing best practices about stopping, tracking disinformation and reacting to it. I really want to see more Japanese and Ukrainian collaboration and information sharing. The Ukrainians are unfortunately the world's experts in knowing how to combat Russian influence and propaganda because they've been doing it for the longest time. And so learning from what they're doing, I think, would be very helpful for Japan, especially because they're using AI really well, but also in terms of counteracting what Russia is doing and also tracking some of the narratives. Using AI is the best way to make this go quicker. So there's also positive uses of AI here. I think I'll stop there. You can look at the cat. I think it's more interesting anyway. But I hope that sums up sort of how I see what's going on in the information space now and how it's affecting Japan too, because it's not looking unfortunately. But thank you for listening.
Thanks for that really expansive talk. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the audience. So I guess,
Well, first of all, thank you for being here today. Apart from the strategy mentioned, I'm talking about the broadcast there. Apart from the strategy mentioned, the broadcast covered the talk. What really stands out in the ideal statement for common use that we have been anti-integration as we use some of others. And I wonder, are they reflecting the Russian ideology, or are they selected to be affiliates to the targets, European or US in Europe for because?
It's a really good question because it sort of teases out the nuances of what the actual goals of Russian influence operations are, which is not to support Russia. Contrary to popular belief, it's actually just to divide the societies that they're targeting. They're not putting out like, love Russia, support Russian right. No, like they want to tear apart Western democracies and watch them fall. And so they'll support and they'll say whatever they need to say to do that. And the US is the best example of how that's just disintegrated the entire country.
yes.
I have a lot of questions, but I want again. I will summarize into one sentence like all from what you have mentioned, like is the presentation. Do you think if changing the view of it like technology, then you will see like another view of the
What do you mean by changing it?
So, the first case itself, like here, like, disinformation, like, to other countries and even like within, Russia. Do you think the Western countries are also doing that kind of disinformation to around the world?
They're not doing it to this extent. And also there's not covert influence operations. Of course, every country wants to convince other countries of, that it's correct and that it wants to influence, those minds. And there's specific case studies of countries like France doing that in West Africa. Especially like online, there's a very famous case study of French bots fighting Russian bots in Mali because that's like a target area for the French government. But it's very rare and it's not on this scale. That might all change now that the Trump administration is now doing what it's doing. I think Western version of this is more overt and not as covert. And that's the big difference between authoritarian countries and democracies. I think what Trump administration is doing now is just overt, like lying, which has its own.
Because just like taking the example of Ukraine, like over the world, like people have been focusing a lot on the Ukraine sides and criticizing Russia. However, I'm not discussing like the reason why the Russian war occurs because it's very complex. However, the world is focusing on criticizing the Russia without like neglecting the reason why the war occurs. So why, if you say that Russia have such a strong like power to do the disinformation, then why the world are still focusing on criticizing them?
I disagree. I think there's a lot of discourse about why the war started and what Russia's goals are. I think actually a lot of, including Western experts and Western politicians, actually agree with some of the Russian points. And so I disagree with you. I think there's a lot of discourse. I think it might seem that way because Russia is the aggressor and it invaded a sovereign country kind of for no reason. And so, of course, the first reaction is, of course, anti-Russian. And Russia is in the wrong. But I do think it's really been well analyzed and well debated online. And there's still a lot of conversation.
For the case of Japan, then I feel like the case in 2023 is not really strong enough to show how like disinformation is happening in Japan. Because I feel like Japan right now, the focus is more on like military, but not on the cognitive side, but more like on like physical like military. So do you think like just like because why I say like the 23 is not so like persuasive is because like what happened if that same like similar occasion occurs in China or Russia, then what would be the response of like other countries? Will it be the same?
I don't think it would be the same because other countries don't have the same covert means of trying to show, very explicitly lie about something like this, where the water was safe to release, and it was very easy to say that it wasn't. And this example is not really a domestic Japanese example of disinformation. It's a foreign country trying to show other countries that Japan is in the wrong. And so that's why I think the Fukushima release is a really good example of how Japan is targeted, because it actually doesn't have much to do with actual Japanese public and their opinion, but more on the rest of the world, and trying to discredit them in sort of this like China versus Japan war.
Other questions? Yes.
So like, there's so many people who use social media these days, right? And like, I think the Fukushima is from Twitter, right? I think it's one.
It's like everywhere.
Yeah, it's like everywhere, right? And like they use like this video of like others. What was it?
Mexico.
Oh yeah, the Mexico one. Yeah, so is it really unavoidable that like this propaganda and this like what? Was exposed to the others, like because it seems like most people will saw the post and they will like they immediately believe it without actually checking the source of their post.
Yeah, so what is the question?
Oh, is it like really unavoidable of this propaganda posts to be exposed in the public?
You mean, is it like inevitable that this happens?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, because the internet is sort of place where you can post whatever you want, which is like the beauty of it and a necessary thing for also like the world to work and function in a non-authoritarian way. That said, it also leaves a room for like this infinite spew. And so what we need to do is balance that with like actual truth, so it's not just this, which is like really difficult to do because I'm not employed by like the Russian state to sit and take comments all day. So I don't have like a positive answer for you, unfortunately, because especially I think the biggest thing that would really impact this is holding the tech companies accountable and having the trust and safety teams really do their job. And that has to come from the US government because they're all heroes, unfortunately. And like that's not enough. They're just emboldened to do whatever they want. I mean, this also occurred before Trump came into office, by the way. Some of these trust and safety teams were already getting small and small. So unless we as consumers pressure them, we're in a bad place.
So everything is in the hand of the US.
Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe I made that too gloomy. I mean, in some ways, yeah, unfortunately. But it's also up to us. Like we use this every day. If the product is bad, people will stop using it. And that's also happening. Like people are getting off these sites. Like Twitter. I mean, it's a mess. And so people are leaving. And so actually we have more, well, really turning this around, we have more more power than we think. It's not just in like the Trump hand. Yeah. Yes.
I think we should. Can you talk a little bit more about what kind of data sets or what kind of information the Ukrainian version of the LLM will be using for when they need it in terms of like funneling data or research? What are you mean?
You mean how the Ukrainians use AI like for positive?
Yeah.
So there's a few Ukrainian tech companies, like actually really small startups with like 3 people in them, that have that use AI to track some of the narratives that are coming out. And they just are able to see what Russia is trying to say when an event happens. And they kind of, what Ukraine does well and Japan does really badly is like working between different sectors. So like they'll send into the government, they'll work with the government, the journalists, civil society. And I think that makes the process really effective. Like they're able to streamline this super fast and use some of these tools quickly. Whereas if this happened in Japan, like even between different ministries, they don't talk to each other. So it'd be really difficult for like, let's say me as a researcher to then tell the Japanese government, hey, like look what I found using that software. So that's like an example of how AI is used. It can really help. That, yeah.
Going back to strategies and means, this time, like those, for most of you want to say, but that's for kind of overall interceptors. So I wonder how they reach and how are they received by the diaspora around the world, for example, Chinese roles or Russian people roles. And sometimes also, when you have Chinese, for example, Chinese students in the US or Canada or Europe or Russian even in Europe too. Are those people usually fitting or control their country, or are they usually social to country?
Unfortunately, these operations are effective. Especially the most famous case studies is Australia and Canada, in terms of the Chinese diaspora, where there was a really big effort from the Chinese government to like influence elections in those countries by mobilizing the vote of their dual nationals or the diaspora. And what that does, unfortunately, is like fuel anti-immigrant sentiment, which is not in those countries, which is obviously not good. And it's not the whole diaspora that thinks this way, but because it does have an influence, countries like Canada have tried to mitigate it in some way, but it's really difficult because it's on the Chinese sites, which are so different from the Western ones, and you can basically only download them in China. We don't but Canadian government doesn't know how to use them too, so it's a difficult problem with a lot of like different policy problems like anti-immigration.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I would ask, like, given the propaganda that is circling around the web, like from Russia, from China, from the US and such, how would you say that we as normal citizens navigate this media space? What is the best way? Or is it like an issue with no solution? Or is it an issue at
I think the best way is to know it's happening. I think a lot of people don't realize it, or they think that they can't be affected by this, that they're not targets of it. I mean, that first post I showed about Ukraine, like I said, it was just my phone. Every story I was clicking was that. And it looks like it's supporting Ukraine. That's the crazy thing. People didn't realize. And so just knowing that, like, hey, maybe you think about what you're posting, and like refueling, and that accounts that aren't vividly or like very obviously pro-Russian or pro-right wing might also be doing this. Yeah, and also just being better about the media you consume, being more literate, and looking at like the news sources that you do trust that have credibility and that isn't from the network.
I do think that there's like no sort of filter that what people can consume and what's good or what's bad. Like it depends on themselves, right? So it's kind of difficult to actually stop the propaganda and such.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Since you talked about LLM, I'm not sure if this is strength the topic, but how biased do you think ChatGPT or any other like popular AI models is right now? And like, do you have any personal experience where you ask them a question and the answer kind of make you think like it's kind of biased towards a certain country or certain like ideal or policy?
Yeah, so this study that I linked to, it talks about that because they did exactly that to track it and see if is it actually turning out, is it actually infecting the LLMs? And they found that it would cite pretty often. I think the number was like 40%, something very high. Like actual the Pravda network sites as a source. So like, you know, when you type up like an answer and then it kind of links the sources and you click on those and some of them are from this network. So unfortunately it is effective sometimes when you have to look through those sources or through the answer to see if it's fine.
Yeah.
After studying this, do you see this as like a big contributor to segregation happening in the US?
Like I think it's number one.
Number one cause.
Because it's also it's I mean this is like at the you can see this in many layers, this problem like in the US for example that happens and it ends up reaching the top layer and so the politicians you elect just make this problem worse because like the goals of this operation is to split everyone to the extremes, which it did. And so then the politicians that get elected and take that to the even further extremes and start doing the job of this for the people that did this, you know, like it's able to sort of have the same effect. So I think it's the number one reason, unfortunately.
I think one thing that was really interesting that you mentioned was just kind of how purveyors of disinformation themselves lost their jobs to AI, right? Which suggests that the costs of doing disinformation have been significantly lowered, meaning that like with fully agentic AI, pretty much not anybody, but like any kind of state with kind of even minimal resources potentially could launch campaigns that are massive, right? So have you seen more actors entering the disinformation space beyond kind of the usual suspects?
That a lot of these operations don't even stem from Moscow. They're from North Macedonia, from Nigeria, from India. So they're just like contractors for this. So it's business. That's all it is.
Which then, but likewise, the content that you're encountering, there are a couple issues that are also interesting I'd like to hear more about. And one is that just like for young people who are getting information from an LLM, the tendency is to just like, oh, well, this is what ChatGPT has told you, so this is accurate, right? There's not a lot of questioning or checking the sources. Whereas it used to be if you were creating like kind of a fake mirror website, it would take a lot of effort to make it look credible. But if somebody like clicks on the link of a news story, that it like looks like a website. How are LLMs changing kind of the information space in a way that might not be positive, right? Which would make kind of disinformation easier for the purveyors of it.
Are you asking about the actual algorithm behind?
Not the actual, so just how we get information, just how we are, so like it used to be like you do internet searches and you get like a list, like, so if I was interested in North Macedonia, for example, type it in and then I would get like a list of different sources and then I'd be able to evaluate like, oh, this comes from that kind of like websites, the news media, whereas now if we're just asking, tell me about this issue, kind of the dispute between North Macedonia and Bulgaria, into an LLM, it just gives us a straight answer, right? Are we being conditioned to just not fact check, right? We just kind of trust the LLM.
Yeah, because we think the LLM has scraped the entire internet to find us the answer. It's checked every possible source possible. It must be accurate, which is, I mean, the goal behind the creators of it. But when you overwhelm that data set with like 90% Russian throughout the network, unfortunately, the source it's going to give you in that one line is what it thinks everyone thinks, which is just actually just one dude in the front.
Or a bot.
Yeah.
Fine. Consistent with that question? No. Hey, yes.
We used to like US elections, like US like media looks like you have certain media that will look at like what Trump does and try to demonize it. So like let's say like if Kamala won, like with like the bots or like the information like disinformation campaigns, will they like switch it up to like kind of make the other side like local media try to ramp up what they're saying to make who they want to look better? Like depending on the candidates, like rile up the media.
Yeah, because the point is division and chaos. They don't care. Well, yeah, I mean, they do care about who wins, but the whole point is to like make everyone hate each other. So if Combo was leading them, they would change their content.
Excellent. We have time for maybe one last question. If there is. Yes.
My question like is going forward, where to draw the limit for freedom of speech then?
That's not
That's so mean of you. It's so evil to ask the most difficult like, existentialist question, because this is something I think about all the time. I mean, of course, if you ask me, of course, I'm pro free speech. I want the most free internet, blah, 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 disagree with censorship. And then I look at this stuff all day and I think like myself, what do? Do we also become authoritarian and control very tightly the internet and take everything down that is programmed? Of course not. It's like, and so this is a question that no one can answer. And it's up to us as like the users of this to see how much we will put up with before we these platforms. Because if it's all AI slop, no one wants to interact with more. And so yeah, anyway, the freedom of speech question is something I think about.
Excellent. Well, Maya, thank you so much for the presentation and answering kind of questions from our audience today. So that's it. And also thank you to all of you for showing up and for your great questions.